and we're talking today with Steve Hackett. Once again, thankfully the third time I've now had the opportunity to talk to you, Steve, and we're talking today about Under the Mediterranean Sky, new album coming out later on this week. It's going to be coming out on Friday. Been already listening through the album. I think I've listened to it probably a total of 3 times now, wow. the preview tracks, and enjoying the heck out of it. I'd like to go kind of track by track and get some more details on each one of the inspiration. But to start, where did the first inspiration come of? Were you saying, okay, I want to do this sort of an acoustic nylon guitar based album, especially considering the prior one didn't have anything of the sort, and it was all electric?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'd avoided doing anything with an acoustic guitar. Really, there was a tiny bit of that, but it was not a main feature on anything. I'd been messing around with some guitar tunings. One of them was a sort of G minor, another one was a G major. And I was writing a lot of stuff on that, thinking, first of all, I was thinking they could all be in the same piece. And then I realized I had a number of pieces and I needed to punctuate them with themes. Now, it was my wife who said, you could do a much broader album than usual when you're doing acoustic stuff by using this idea of different countries as themes, places around the Mediterranean. And she suggested the title, Under a Mediterranean Sky, which I absolutely loved. So really, it was her input that gave it a portal into this kind of music and also gave it a frame in a way. And I think that the way that you receive instrumental music like this, if it's got an extra meaning, when you're writing it, there's extra depth there. It's a broader canvas. So I have to thank her for that.
Was there a particular reasoning for the order of the tracks kind of on this tour of these locations around the Mediterranean? Was there a particular plan to start in Malta and then go to the coasts of Croatia, et cetera, kind of moving around that way?
No, we weren't thinking of it geographically. Initially, I had 2 potential openers, one of which is Medina, the one that starts out the album. The other one was Sirocco, which had to my mind, it had an Egyptian flavor. I was trying to describe Egypt, but then beyond that, different Arabian places that we'd visited, Jordan and Petra, and places that existed around and in the desert. And Cairo is basically bordering the desert. And we had a trip up the Nile, which was just absolutely amazing. And we took in as many sites as possible. Just stunning stuff that looks like it was painted or sculpted yesterday. That was a huge influence. But in terms of the running order of the album, it's always the same in a way. You've got to have all the contenders done, and then you figure out which is the best order so that when they follow each other, it works. So I started out with a heavily orchestrated beginning. Then the second track is just acoustic guitar. Then we tend to return to the orchestra again. And so it's been this sort of big picture, small picture, big picture, small picture thing that I managed to continue throughout most of the album, really.
Yeah, there's definitely an ebb and a flow to the song. So let's start with Medina, Medina, the walled city. The inspiration for that, to start with this city within a city, if you will.
Yeah, in a way, Malta, which is the setting. Of course, you've got, as you say, a city within a city. Valletta is the capital. Malta is the country. And the island, which was heavily under siege in the Second World War and had been under siege from so many different cultures dating back centuries, of course, millennia. So I wanted to start the album with this sort of siege mentality. So it comes blasting in with orchestra. And then gradually it opens up and starts to tell the story in retrospect, in my mind. It goes back to an earlier period where it's more primitive music. Then eventually, having gone back to return of theme of the siege, I wanted it to end with a love story. In other words, the idea of war and peace, or rather war and love, and so it ends up with a big romantic theme at the end, and it's the longest track on the album, coming in at about 9 minutes. Other tracks use this thematic device, a little bit like concertos or suites, where you develop things in a classical way. So I suppose in spirit it's classical, but then it's landscaping in terms of spirit, really. My dad was a painter, painted many very beautiful landscape scenes, and this is my version of it, doing it with music.
Adriatic blue, as is written in the copy here, the deep blue sea along the Croatian coastline. I looking up a little bit about that. I'd never realized. I mean, a lot of this is introduction to me, even looking around the Mediterranean, because I've never been there before in my life, and seeing the white cliffs of Croatia. I'm used to the white cliffs of Dover, but not the white cliffs of Croatia.
Yeah. Well, Croatia, the extraordinary thing about the coastline is that it looks like the place should be called Creation, to be honest. And it looks like, I would imagine, the Garden of Eden may have looked, if such a place existed. In a way, it's a very idealized, extraordinary coastline. So very, very beautiful. Sometimes you look out and you can't tell whether what you're looking at is foliage, or if it's lakes or trees, or what it is. It all seems to mix. And of course, first time I was there, we ended up in Dubrovnik, where I was working with a Hungarian band. The guys from Hungary are called Jarbe, and when I play with them, it's 99% improvised music. And I finally got to the place where in Dubrovnik they have this extraordinary thing. The rooftops of Dubrovnik have this kind of terracotta look to them. And then there's a fort where we were playing, as it happens. And years and years ago, again, it was something that my father had done. One of his early paintings before he became a professional artist was the rooftops of Dubrovnik. And so there I was, and experiencing this, and I wanted to create an idea of the celebration of it. So even though it's an unaccompanied guitar piece with nylon guitar, I wanted it to sound like fanfares, in as much as you could do something that sounds very exuberant but thematic with a nylon guitar. It's a stretch of the imagination, but I remember seeing Segovia show this when he was doing something to camera. We were saying, this is brass, this is cello, this is such and such, pianissimo, showing the different colors of the guitar. So I've played that to a few people, and they thought, maybe, is it 12-string guitar? But no, it's nylon. It's just played very, very bright near the bridge. And those chords are very triumphant sounding.
We touched on Sirocco a little bit, and the winds of the Sirocco, essentially, the meteorological effect of that. You can feel that in the instrumentation, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory that also must have tied into the arrangement of that particular work.
Yeah. Again, I think it's so much about landscaping, really, and having visited Egypt, the last Arabian place we went to, the Nile is so unspoiled in most places. It is just lined with palm trees. It's extraordinarily idyllic. It's as if time has been rolled back 3,000 years. When I was first there, opposite the Sphinx, I had my notepad out the whole time, and I was just hearing music non-stop, so I was writing this down. So whenever I traveled to these exotic locations, I tend not to take an instrument with me, but I've got a notepad and ideas come up. So I was writing them down. First of all, I was thinking in terms of rock music. But then I thought, if you strip away rhythm, perhaps it'll work in another way. It'll float into view, pretty much like a mirage. I've actually sat at a place called the Mirage Cafe when I was in Jordan, and there is a real thing. It looks like water. And this sort of trompe d'oeil, the trick of the eye, and you get this kind of stuff. And in a way, I was also thinking right at the end of it that the way Grieg wrote, Norwegian composer, sometimes taking his time about the very last chords of something and really drawing it out, that was an influence, amongst other things, of course.
Joie de vivre. I love the bounce to that. It really stood out to me in that. Was there a particular, and I've always been fascinated by France, never been there, but studied it in the language in high school. Was there any particular part of France that somehow, and you mentioned some of the aspects of like the vistas and the music and the food, that influenced this particular sound and that little jumpiness that I sort of detected in the rhythm of that song?
Well, I traveled a lot in France, did many gigs in many places, and particularly with Genesis in the 1970s. I mean, we would draw up at places, and first of all, it would seem as if, we're closed, and there's this sort of surly kind of, if you must. And then we go in, and then it suddenly produced this extraordinary banquet. And it's the way the French were. It was this kind of, once they open up to you, suddenly it all changes. And I remember traveling through the Loire Valley with Genesis. We'd done Germany. We went through the Rhine Valley, then we were through the Loire Valley, following the wine growing region everywhere. And of course, we were young guys at that point, enjoying ourselves, drinking with a will. And it was always great fun. I loved playing Paris. Also, of course, Belgium, which was the first place that really took to Genesis. They were extraordinarily hospitable. So same language, smaller country, but Joie de Vivre also relates to them. And it was a title suggested by Jo because her family on her father's side were French, and she got used to going over there. And when she was a small child, they were getting her drunk at the age of 4. So that's that kind of joie de vivre, a very different kind of attitude towards the sort of prohibition that the rest of the world seems to be subject to. But that's the French for you.
The Memory of Myth has the violin, Christine Townsend playing. How was her work selected to play in a piece about Greece? What was the connection there?
Well, again, I have to mention my wife again. That's her melody. Jo wrote that line that Christine plays at the beginning. Now, later in the track, Roger King orchestrated it. And so you get all the harmonies, and then you get it with guitar. And then down the line, you get it with, I was using the Peruvian charango, rather like either a mandolin or the bouzouki. So I was using it in that sort of what I think of as a mandolin style, and even just a combination of those two small stringed instruments creates a big picture. The other stuff I was doing was more improvised, and that's something that Jo said she wanted me to do, to play in almost like a folk style. So I wasn't refining it. I was doing spontaneous stuff, and she wanted it to be like that because she said, if we give it this title, The Memory of Myth, it'll seem like a distant dream, like something you can't quite hold on to. So it's the most impressionistic, I think, of pieces on the album, which incidentally I had a great time doing. I loved doing the album.
What drew you to, in effect, cover, I mean, the one kind of quote unquote cover of Scarlatti's Sonata?
I'd seen. First of all, I had an album of Segovia playing that, and it was called "The Song of the Guitar." And what I didn't realize was that all those pieces had been taken from a film that he made, playing at the Alhambra in Andalusia, and I thought the piece really showed the colors of the guitar. He was using a lot of reverb on it, and I got something like the same sound, but we decided to compress it some more to give it a kind of power. And then, as well as working with the reverb, I wanted to do this thing that he didn't do, but it was shown to me by another guitarist who I think invented this technique, a great friend of mine who passed recently. His name was Theodore Cheng, and although he spoke with a British accent, he looked like a Chinese Segovia. He had that look, the sort of very wise, very gentle. And he showed me this technique, which was cross-string trilling. So across two strings, when you're playing semitones, if you use four fingers, and for anyone who's a classical player, they would understand a PAIM to get that combination. And it's a fantastic technique. It enables you to make the trills really stand out rather than hammering on and off where the trills are a little bit submerged or don't really have the power. So with regular classical technique, the trills don't have the power. But this other technique that I'd heard two other guitarists use, Theo and Elliot Fisk. Now, I don't know whether he showed it to Elliot, who'd worked with Leonard Bernstein, but it's a very, very interesting, very intricate technique, and nobody who tries it gets it first time. Believe me, it took me ages to get this technique, and I've used it fairly liberally on the album. So I used it on the Scarlatti because Scarlatti, of course, keyboard player, born 1685, same year as Bach and Handel. Domenico Scarlatti worked with the Portuguese court. Very ornate playing, harpsichord work, beautiful stuff. So I was trying to reflect the power of the harpsichord, but using a guitar to do it.
Casa del Fano, getting over towards Pompeii. There's a brightness to this particular work. How did that come from that particular location in the little statue of the faun?
First of all, some years ago, we were going to do a couple of live acoustic concerts with a trio, and when we were rehearsing, I just came up with this idea on the spot, and I'd been inspired by visiting Pompeii for years. I started going almost 50 years ago to Pompeii. Every time I can, I'll go and visit. But the very first time I went, it was very, very early in the morning, and I just broke away from the main group. I wanted to be on my own, to explore the place on my own. There was nobody there. Imagine having a whole city unearthed from volcanic eruption where you're the only player on the stage. And it was wonderful to walk out on it. And I felt so at home. I almost felt that I'm going to nip around the corner and get a loaf of bread. It felt that intimate and so close. And of course, it would have been one of the most beautiful houses. All that's left of it, the atrium, the inside, is just this little statue. So it's been named the House of the Faun, Casa del Fauno in Italian. And it was Roger who came up with the kind of elegiac adagio-like introduction to it, which was based on something that he'd done live just in one go, which sounded amazing to me. And I said, if you can remember exactly what you did. So we got a film of it, and he listened to it and he said, I think I can do this slightly better. And so he really came up with that, and we shared the credit on that. it's also a flute feature for my brother John and Rob Townsend, it's basically a lullaby. So it's a very gentle piece, although it's largely improvised with a big solo in the middle from flute. Basically, I was thinking of something very, very simple, almost like a school song, tuned to G major. It's basically 3 chords. There are a few diminished ones that crop up at a certain point, but the second half of it, I just wanted it to be like the simplicity of life in Pompeii as I imagined it at one time, the beauty of it, the gentleness of it.
The next one is there's so much musical depth in terms of instrumentation with the Dervish and the Jinn. That's the next one in line, bringing together especially the geopolitical aspect of this. And I'll let you describe how all of that came about with the history of Persia to what we have today, and then the instrumentation that came in, including the tar, which I have to presume is, and if I could just do some research on my own, but I have to presume that is the ancestor of the guitar, for example.
Yeah, all of this, if you're talking about guitar ancestors, it seems as if the ancient Greeks came up with an instrument called the kithara, which sounds awfully close to the word guitar. But of course, I think the idea of guitar means gut. And I think guitar means gut for some reason. The tar is a small scale instrument, but the guy who plays it for us on this, his name is Malik Mansurov from Azerbaijan, and he's one of the players on it. The duduk starts it out, this blown instrument, which is so often found in exotic film soundtracks, and the guy that did that. His name is Petrosen, and he's from Armenia. Now, these two, I'd constructed this thing together, and then those two nations were at war with each other over a disputed region, the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Anyway, but I always think that music does something that politicians don't do. You know, politicians seem intent on driving people apart, whereas music is a kind of a resolving thing or a healing thing. And there are other players on this. We've got beautiful sax playing from Rob Townsend, once again, playing soprano sax. But the idea of it was something which gets faster and faster, like a whirling dervish. And I've seen dervish dancers twice when I've been in Egypt. And it's an extraordinary thing to watch, because they transform as they spin, and they pull things out from their clothes, and at one point it just looks like they turn off the lights and it looks like a spinning top, you know, like a whole kind of merry-go-round going round, but it's going very, very fast. You just wonder how it's physically possible. So it's music to an imaginary dervish. And the gin, of course, is not the drink, but in this case, it's the genie. So all stuff from that area, Persia, Turkey, as we know it, Istanbul, one time Constantinople, all of that. So although I haven't visited Turkey myself, not yet, my wife Jo had. So again, it was a title suggested by her. So as you can imagine, she's had quite a lot of influence on this album.
It's a nice musical contrast to then go right to Lorato, as noted, love from the African Swana tribe.
Yeah, Lorato, basically it's an unaccompanied guitar piece, but I like to think that it's rapturous. It's deliberately, it's in an open G tuning, and to get that, just taking the bass strings, both bass strings down a tone, and that gives you the ability to play more freely in the key of G. You've got lots of open strings that fit that, and it also works in the key of D. So I'm hovering between those two keys doing this piece. Starts out in G. In a way, it's deliberately naive, but keeps the pace up. So I want a kind of innocence that suits the guitar. There's something about the purity of sound of the guitar, and I don't apologize for it. I think it's not introverted. I think it's radical. So I think it's, for me, it's radical romanticism.
On to the next one, Andalusian Heart. And I perked up in some of your interviews when you were mentioning Concierto, and I apologize if I screw up the pronunciation, Concierto de Aranjuez from Rodrigo, and the tie-in to Sketches of Spain. And I remember that piece because that, going back to the Adagio, into what Miles Davis did, and then into what Chick Corea did, which ultimately led to what Al Jarreau did with I Can Recall Spain, which is quite honestly one of my favorite vocal jazz songs I've ever performed in my life. It might be the number one favorite vocal jazz piece I've ever performed. So as soon as I heard that connection, I went, hey, wait a minute, that is a connection there. You noted that in those interviews. How did those two tie together, combined with everything that you saw in Spain?
To write something in a typical Spanish style, I've been trying to write this sort of thing for years, and I was thinking of Rodrigo, and I was also thinking of Leonard Bernstein, and a combination of the two really produced this track. It's thematic. First of all, the theme comes in with guitar playing the chords with very gentle orchestra behind it. We use oboe. He's a French oboe player who lives in Arizona, and we'd become friends. He sent his performance. It had to be, because this was, it is a lockdown album. The guitar carries the main weight of the piece, and again, I wanted to keep the pace up. And there's something about Aranjuez. I remember the first time I'd seen it live. I'd heard it once and fell in love with it. Watching it live, I think it was Julian Bream, and he did something in a rising section before the big theme comes in, where it sounded to me like the sound of 1,000 fountains. It sounded like harp, but only more so. It just seemed to be impossibly full and busy. And so I use this technique that I've developed for doing 1,000 things at once with the right hand. And of course, it's a rising shape, and I wanted it to build to fever pitch and then bring the theme in at the end. And it's Christine Townsend once again, with a major amount of violin and viola work on it, plus other instruments. And I think it's one of the best payoffs that we've got on the album. The big theme comes in, big romantic thing at the end. It's one of several moments where we get a big theme coming in, where we're giving it the wide silver screen treatment, really, at that point.
That, of course, the penultimate track, the final one, The Call of the Sea, and it's sort of a nice, peaceful conclusion, and then it's in effect a focus on what is the Mediterranean ultimately the core about? Well, it's the sea, the Mediterranean Sea right there, and imagine it's easy to picture yourself being on the water listening to that particular work.
I think the guitar is it can be a very evocative instrument, especially if you're arpeggiating quickly, to make it bubble away. So I introduced it after this very kind of very tranquil introduction. Very quickly it starts bubbling away furiously, and then the second half of the thing is something that I'd written, and I thought it sounded, when I recorded it, I thought, I don't know if this is any good. This sounds a little bit like Bach, but not as good. And again, Joe said to me, well, what if you orchestrate it so you've got it supported by strings? And Roger did some things, and it sounded so different. It kind of gave it wings, and I'm very glad I fished it out of the bin and we used it to close the album. So doing something again very, very gentle. So it's back to that almost that sort of siesta feel that I'd recorded other acoustic albums, that I wanted to have the pace on this album. So it's a pacier album, but right at the end, yes, I've got to let it go out on that tranquil sea. There's no other way. So it goes out on a sunset for me.
It is a musically rewarding album. It is a musically deep album, and it comes out very soon. And I would encourage anyone listening to give it a full listen through a few times over, like I did. Under a Mediterranean Sky, Steve Hackett, thank you for taking some extra time to go into detail on all things about this album, and looking forward to the official release and more touring and even more music coming from you down the road.
Thank you so much, Lou.